Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ford Presidential Library. My name is Elaine Didier, and it's my privilege to serve as the director of the library here in Ann Arbor and the museum in Grand Rapids. We are very pleased to have you with us tonight for this program. Tonight's program is brought to you by our parent organization, the National Archives and Records Administration, with additional support from the Ford Presidential Foundation. For those of you who are members of Friends of Ford, we thank you for your support because that's what makes possible programs like this one. And now let's talk about tonight. We are very honored to host Michael Giorgione here to talk about Camp David, a mysterious and intensively private hideaway used by presidents and their families and visiting world leaders for more than 75 years. Rear Admiral Michael Giorgione is a 1981 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. He served for 29 years of active duty in the Navy Civil Engineer Corps. From 1999 to 2001, then as a commander, he was the commanding officer of Camp David. And I just learned that we have with us tonight a preceding commanding officer of the camp. So we have a truth checker with us tonight for all of his stories. So we're very pleased that you can be here. Michael's tour of duty overlapped the end of the term of Bill Clinton and the beginning of the George W. Bush presidency. At that time, he was the 17th commanding officer of Camp David, which is about 200 acres in size and is in the Catoctin Mountains in Maryland, and it's quite a very special place. Now in civilian life, Admiral Giorgione is currently the president and founder of Leading Leaders, a consulting firm, and in addition serves as chairman of the board for the CB Memorial Scholarship Association, which raises money for children and grandchildren of CBs. So that's a great program. Tonight we're going to be hearing about his brand new book, Inside Camp David, The Private World of the Presidential Retreat, which combines a history of the camp itself based on interviews with camp commanding officers, first-person anecdotes of the first families, although he told me that he really protected identities, so we'll see how far we can press him on that, as well as his own family's experience living at the camp. And I want to say that this is a special program for me because I'm one of the maybe two or maybe a few more in the audience who have had the privilege of visiting Camp David. I was there at the end of the George W. Bush term in June of 2008 when First Lady Laura Bush hosted not just me, but all of the Presidential Library directors for a tour and a working meeting talking about what it takes to create a presidential library and how you keep a presidential library alive and relevant as the presidency passes, and in the end, of course, the president himself passes on. It was a very substantive conversation, but yes, we had wonderful tours in golf carts all around the camp, seeing all the facilities led by First Lady Bush. So that was a pretty incredible experience. As you'll see more, we're gonna learn more about it from our speaker. And since this is the very first presidential library at which Admiral Giorgione has ever spoken, please give him a warm Ann Arbor Presidential Library welcome tonight.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's a great honor to have served our Navy and nation for the time I was able to do that. It's a great honor to be here tonight. I'd like to thank the Ford Foundation, Elaine Didier, for hosting me tonight, and Kate Murray, the events coordinator, for putting this together. Thank you all, and to all the staff at the Ford Library for this honor. My goal tonight is to teach you a bit about the historical picture and fabric of Camp David and how our 14 presidents have used it over the past 76 years, share some personal anecdotes and insights, share how it was to raise a young family inside the camp, and then take your questions. So with that, as Elaine shared, she's been to Camp David. This is the other couple that she alluded to, Commander Joe and Susie Camp. Please stand. He was also a commanding officer at Camp David. Thank you for your service. And they live in nearby town. Who else has been to Camp David? Anyone else? Couple in the back. You lived in Thurmont, you told me. So you know the area of Thurmont, Maryland, which is just north of Frederick, Maryland, south of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Okay? So I want to mostly talk tonight about what it's like when the president is there, when the president, the family, world leaders are present at Camp David. But let me start with a unique feature tonight for the first time and share with you what it's like when the president is not there. Camp David is very much a constant series of highs and lows. Cacophony and excitement when the president's there with his guests, and utter quietness and serenity when he is not. At night, if you walked around the grounds, you would see no lights from towns below. You would hear no aircraft above. You would hear your footsteps, and that might be it. Maybe in the summer, the tree canopy moved by a gentle breeze. In the winter, the light shaft of moonlight lightens up the ice-encrusted branches of the tree. You feel your breath freeze as you exhale and walk the grounds, maybe hearing a distant squirrel, knowing that our Marines are on patrol always, 24/7, on that icy perimeter. This is what it's like when no one's there. It's utterly quiet. It's almost eerily quiet. The inky blackness of the night, no one around, no excitement as you and your crew prepare and are always ready to receive the President of the United States. It's also at these times you do some of your deepest thinking about why am I here, what do I do, what history has gone on here, what these trees have seen, what the air has held, what conversations have gone on, what difficult decisions have been made. And you wait, and sometimes wait, to get the word that the president's coming. And then it happens. You hear this. So the helicopter touches down, Marine One, usually from the south lawn of the White House. You're saluting as a commanding officer. You walk down the pathway. The door pops open. Two Marines come out. They take their position. You walk up. You salute the President of the United States, and you welcome to Camp David. And then the weekend begins. That's a typical visit, although it could happen at any other time. Tonight's story begins on Change of Command Day. This is the day, as a naval officer, you take over being in charge of Camp David. This is June 25th, 1999. It's my wife, Michelle, and our two daughters, Brianna and Ryan, ages 7 and 4. On that day, Michelle hands me this blank journal with this inscription from the girls. Dear Daddy, we want you to write stories about Camp David in the President's Journal. Someday our children will be able to read them. We love you, Brianna and Ryan. Well, they're neither married nor have children, but I decided to write the book anyway, thinking ahead. Great foresight, my wife Michelle gave me that journal. And with that, after every visit by President Clinton, the inauguration and President Bush, I wrote down what happened that weekend. And then I put it away and never opened it for 16 years. I don't know why, but I never opened it. Until the idea for the book was born about 2.5 years ago. So today I'm going to talk about the history of Camp David. Why is it a Navy command? What's it all about? How did it start? Talk about some world events and how the presidents use Camp David, both personally as a place to relax, as well as a place to do diplomacy, and then share some stories and insights from my personal time there. with President Clinton and President Bush. The floating White House, USS Potomac, during FDR's time. President Roosevelt loved going out on the floating White House, his presidential yacht. The presidential yacht was manned by what service? Navy sailors, and that's your clue as to why Camp David is operated by the Navy. This is President Roosevelt on the left on the USS Potomac. That's the motorcraft today. Today it is a floating museum in the port of Oakland, California. But in 1942, with the war gearing up, and with concerns about air bombardment and U-boat sightings, the staff said, Mr. President, we can't go out on the presidential yacht anymore. And he said, well, please find me a place I can go to get away from the White House. I could go to Warm Springs, Georgia. I could go there, but find me somewhere nearby. And coincidentally, as the camp staff looked around, the White House staff, they found some cabins. They found a number of 3 sightings in the nearby area, from the Shenandoah Mountains to the Catoctin Mountains. And all these cabins were built during part of the New Deal, the recovery program from the Depression in the United States. And some of those cabins were built by members of the Civilian Conservation Corps to put men back to work to rebuild our national parks, roads, etc. And interestingly, they brought 3 sites to President Roosevelt. He toured one of them, and in July of 1942, he showed up this one called Catoctin, High Catoctin, Camp number 3, and said, this is it. I have found my Shangri-La. Right? That's the original name of Camp David, Shangri-La. Where does Shangri-La come from? That title. Yes, President Roosevelt also referred to the Doolittle Raid on Tokyo as the planes coming from Shangri-La, and it's from the novel Lost Horizon. I guess Roosevelt had this whimsical nature to him about a place of mysterious intrigue, a utopian society, and so he called it Shangri-La. And its name remained that way for a number of terms until it was renamed Camp David. And who was this young man? David Eisenhower. And what's his relation to the president? Grandson. And where's David Eisenhower today?
Philadelphia.
Very good. And was he your professor, or he taught at University of Pennsylvania for a number of years, retired recently, married to another presidential child? Very good, Julie Nixon. So renamed Camp David. President Eisenhower wasn't even sure about keeping the camp. He said, I've got my farm in Gettysburg, just 20 miles north, but was convinced to keep it, but didn't like the name Shangri-La, thought it was a bit pretentious, and so he renamed it Camp David, and it's remained till this day. This is the President's Lodge, called Aspen. During Roosevelt's time, it was called the Bear's Den. Again, whimsical names. The Bear's Den was essentially that right piece on the photo. It's been added on to over the years. President Eisenhower renamed this cabin and all the other cabins as well. He named this Aspen. Aspen is the state tree of Colorado. Colorado is the home state of Mamie Eisenhower. Therefore, every cabin at Camp David, whether it's a guest cabin where you would stay if you were invited, or a working cabin like the dispensary, the fire station, the admin building, is named after a tree. Doesn't have to be indigenous, but every cabin has a name of a tree. This was where Joe and Susie Camp lived, and this is where I live. This is called Cedar. This is the commanding officer's house, cabin. They look pretty simple, don't they? It's a very nice camp with very plain facilities. Single-story structures, oak plank siding, cedar shake shingle roofs. Enough amenities, but no brass, no polish, no marble. Just the basics, and that's Camp David. That's part of the allure of this mountaintop retreat at 1,800 feet elevation. This is Cedar. This is where my family and I lived and where every other commanding officers lived. As we tell our children, you've got a modest house with a great yard. Okay? But the challenge is, and this is what I know many of you can relate to, is we had 2 young girls, and there are no neighbors. Yes, on weekends your neighbors are the president. But during the day, after school, coming home in the winter, wanting to play, there's no one immediately next door. And that becomes the challenge of a family living inside the camp. You are the only family to live inside Camp David. We have some single sailors and Marines that live in the barracks. but you're the only family. Okay? So a lot of the book and the stories that we all share in the book of the 15 other commanding officers that I interviewed talk about what it was like to raise a family there. The Lonely Sentry is chapter 6. In chapter 6, I talk about the challenges of command, the challenges of being in charge of something. Running this library, Elaine, running your own business, running your own community outreach, a nonprofit organization, your own businesses, your own careers. You know what it's like to be at the top, where all scrutiny is on you. People are always second-guessing you, always questioning you, always think they can do it better. That's what comes with being the boss, with being in charge. And I draw some parallels with my experience, the experiences of my peers who served there, and what it must be like to be the President of the United States. And not really have a place to go to get away that often, but maybe this is the one place they can get away. So the Lonely Sentry is also about that Marine I talked about earlier, walking the perimeter at night when it's sub-zero freezing weather. Always on patrol. A couple snapshots from the Reagan presidency. Reagan's used it the most of any president. There's that arrival I played out for you in the beginning of the program. President Reagan inside Aspen doing work, entertaining world leader Margaret Thatcher of Great Britain. He and First Lady Nancy Reagan absolutely loved Camp David. Spent almost 300 days there in their 8 years. Absolutely lose it, mostly as a place to get away. Did a lot for them. I think our presidents deserve that, need a place to go to get away. Let's take some snapshots, talk about some history with the presidents. President Obama, also inside the Aspen, that picture window again. President Carter sitting on the iconic log that's next to a fish pond. The fish pond was actually put in by President Roosevelt, right in the corner. You'll see a better picture later, because they had a great fear of fire, so it was a backup water supply. President Carter sitting on this log. President Nixon, downfall of his presidency. Very much a reclusive president. Coat and tie, usually dined by himself inside the Aspen living room. This is where he fired Haldeman and Ehrlichman during the Watergate scandal downfall prior to his resignation. President Bush, during my time in his day office in Laurel, the main entertainment and dining cabin. And then this iconic Pulitzer Prize-winning photo of what two presidents? President Eisenhower. This is April 1961 at Camp David. What's going on in the world?
Cuban Missile Crisis. No, Bay of Pigs.
Bay of Pigs.
Right.
So let's think about this. President Kennedy, the newly elected Democrat, young, Hollywood-esque president, calls his predecessor, the five-star retired general, former president, older Republican predecessor, to Camp David and says, how do I fix this? Your administration planned the Bay of Pigs invasion. My administration launched it. We messed it up a bit. The world's calling it a fiasco. I'm a little desperate here. I'm going to show some humility and call you in to say, how do I fix that? And that's what's happening in this photo in April of 1961. Takes a lot of humility, don't you think? Yeah. Okay. Great book, 3 Days in January, talks about this event, among other things, with the Bay of Pigs and other world events. President Roosevelt, inside that Aspen cabin, same fireplace, same hearth. President Roosevelt, you start to think about how they entertain. And he's sitting here with Churchill. Churchill visited twice. This is at a creek just outside the camp in the Catoctin Mountains, Hunting Creek. Think about this, folks. Two world leaders, smoking cigars, throwing a fishing line, I'm sure drinking some bourbon. But what are they talking about? They're talking about the war. They're talking about how and when will the U.S. enter. How will they support the Ally effort? It still comes down to two people building relationships. You have to get face to face. You have to get to know each other. And I think Camp David has done that for 76 years, giving presidents the opportunity to do that with other world leaders as well as their own staffs. Excuse me. President Eisenhower with his young Vice President, Richard Nixon. President Truman, not a fan of Camp David. In his almost 2 full terms, went there 10 times, preferred to go all the way to Key West, Florida for his summer home. So not a lot of history there with President Truman. President Johnson, some heavy times. This is the Vietnam era. President Johnson walking the grounds of Camp David with Ellsworth Bunker, the U.S. ambassador to South Vietnam. Do we escalate the war? Do we get out? Do we increase the bombing? Do we get out? Decides to escalate the war, becomes quite a burden. President Johnson decides not to run for re-election. President Carter, second president who thought of closing Camp David. Georgia farmer, wear a sweater in the White House, turn the lights down, we don't need heat, we don't need air conditioning, keep it simple. Very, very much of a micromanager with the budget and everything else. Thought Camp David was superfluous, over the top. He actually put it on the map. As he was working with Anwar Sadat of Egypt, Menachem Begin of Israel, the First Lady convinced him to bring him there. Bring him to Camp David where you can be more at peace with each other, where it's more quiet, where you can get away, go for a long walk without the scrutiny of the White House grounds or anywhere else. And he did that. And with the historic, just 40 years old now, Camp David Peace Accords of 1978 really made Camp David known as a place for international diplomacy. President Nixon, again, very formal, did entertain world leaders here, Leonid Brezhnev. There's a great story in the book about the blue Lincoln Continental. There's the log again. There's the fish pond. President Reagan did entertain as well. You saw Margaret Thatcher earlier. This is Prime Minister Nakasone of Japan. But principally, he and First Lady Nancy Reagan went there to get away from everyone. Because at Camp David, compared to the second floor residence of the White House, you don't hear light, you see lights, you don't hear sirens, you don't hear protesters. You can truly get away. There is no press, there are no photographers unless the president invites them in. You control the media, there doesn't have to be any media. It's complete peace if that's what you want. Even at Camp David, as well as anywhere else in the world, our presidents still address the nation. President Clinton making a radio address. President Bush, this is September 15th, 2001. This is him talking from the same conference room where Carter sat with Sadat and Begin, addressing how the U.S. would respond to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. President Reagan did over 150 Saturday radio addresses from the back porch of Laurel, always with Nancy by his side. President Obama holding a press conference during one of his few visits to Camp David during his administration. 2012, the G8 summit. The only time in history so far we've had this many world leaders, the G8, I know there are 10 people standing there. The G8 was supposed to be in Chicago in 2012. This was the year of Occupy Wall Street protests. If you've been in major cities that had a Federal Reserve Bank, you knew they were surrounded by protesters for weeks. President Obama wasn't feeling good about safety there, decided on short notice to move it to Camp David, so Commander Wendy Halsey, the CEO at the time, had about 5-day notice that they were all coming over for a world leader sleepover. And this is one of those moments you realize in life when you're serving at Camp David, you're in the world of the presidents, but you're not really of their world. You're in their world. You get to know a lot of personal things about them, what kind of shoes they wear, what they look like at chapel, how they like their hamburger, what they like to drink, what they don't like to drink, what their kids look like, how they talk to each other. But you never lose sense that you are not of their world. And then the commander here is trying to make room assignments in cabins for 8 world leaders. So sometimes you see that ego side of people, those little things that trigger us in various ways, positive and negative. Fascinating time for Camp David to serve. Excuse me. The now declassified photo called the Council of War. President Bush, Vice President Cheney, Secretary Powell, Secretary Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz. This is where we know now Vice President Cheney went on 9/11, as President Bush was scrambled out of the Florida classroom. This is where he assembled in the Laurel cabin to talk about, again, America's response to the 9/11 attacks. How many times do you think President Trump has been to Camp David? Once, at least once, because there's a photo, right? He's been there 7 times, which is still incredibly low. He's taken his cabinet there several times. He's taken his family. He's unfortunately taken no world leaders. And I say unfortunately because in my opinion and many of my peers, that's one of the charms and best uses of Camp David is for international dialogue and diplomacy. And I guess he hasn't seen fit for that use yet. Only been there 7 times. So think about this, though. If you're that sailor or Marine who serves at Camp David and you're always operating, maintaining, taking care of the place, guarding it, and your boss never comes, what's that feel like? It's like you going to work every day and, I mean, your job is to always be ready, right? I'm ready, and I'm still ready, and I'm ready, by the way, and we have a wonderful Thanksgiving meal planned, and I'm still ready. And so now it's a real morale challenge. Part of that lonely sentry dialogue I had with you earlier about leading your crew and keeping them focused on this is our mission, this is what we do. I went through some of that with President Clinton where he had a 5-month lull, no visits. And with President Bush, it was almost every weekend. So again, a lot of highs and lows. What about the lighter side? President Ford and his family loved Camp David. A lot of photos in this wonderful museum and wonderful library in the archives of the Ford family recreating at Camp David in the pool and the grounds, bobsledding, walking the grounds with Liberty, the dog. Great place to get away. Building relationships, President George H.W. Bush, Mikhail Gorbachev of the Soviet Union, the infamous horseshoe incident. It's in the book, but I'll tell you anyway. They're walking the grounds. The Bushes loved horseshoes. They loved all kind of competitive sports. Gorbachev had never thrown a horseshoe. Bush showed him how to do it. Gorbachev tried it, hit a ringer the first time. A great U.S. Navy Seabee. Most of the enlisted crew at Camp David are Seabees, 60%. The rest are fleet rates from our Navy. A Seabee took that horseshoe, routed a plaque, put a brass plate on it, and gave it to President Bush that night for dinner to present to. It's these little things, folks, you realize about relationships and building relationships that are important, even for presidents. Okay? Those little moments you capture. Camp David for many years has been a backdrop for many of those opportunities. During my time, our chapel choir in the Evergreen Chapel, President Clinton loved singing in the adult choir. So every Saturday night, the music would be delivered to Aspen, and every Sunday morning, he and the First family would show up for chapel. They would sit in Pew 1, okay? Pew 1. Our chapel director from Hood College at the time, for 17 years, he led our music programs. These are servicemen and women or spouses, and there's the president. Just singing in, joining our crew. Low-key Sunday service. Just what I think the presidents are looking for. The Kennedys. Presidents have gone horseback riding at Camp David. But during the Kennedy administration, there was a corral built for, what's the pony's name? Macaroni. And here are the 2 children, Caroline and John. Chuck Howell was the commanding officer at Camp David, 1962 to 64. Chuck Howell is still living. He's 92 years old. He lives in Coronado, California, where I reside now. Chuck Howell was there the day of the assassination. Even though you're in their world, but not of their world, you still get to know the family. Chuck and Joanne Howell had 4 children. The oldest son, Hank, was 12 years old. Hank was a big brother to John. When they would visit, they would play together. John would call him Soldier Boy, Hank, and they'd run around. There's a very poignant story about this day in November of '63, and young Hank comes back from school crying, sobbing that he's lost his little buddy. He'll never see him again, which they never did. And the camp goes in this very somber atmosphere, lowers our flag to half-mast, say a prayer, and get ready for the next president to take charge. These are those gripping moments you get to know someone and then it can be gone in a fleeting instance. Personal moments where Joanne Howell once answered the door at Cedar because Mrs. Kennedy was knocking on it. Knock, knock, knock. Joanne, can your kids come out and play? Those little things that children bring us together for. Mentioned George H.W. Bush. President Bush loved recreating. Here he is hitting tennis balls with Chrissy Everett at the Magnolia Tennis Courts. The Clinton family, the extended Clinton family, always went to Camp David for Thanksgiving. So for 8 years, they went to Thanksgiving. We got to host the last 2. And then the president, on his own time, would go to our galley where our members and our families were having dinner, and he would walk around handing out presidential M&Ms and posing for photos. Many stories, the Bushes, the Reagans, the Clintons, posing with crew members and families for photos during their downtime. Just those little compassionate, humanistic things you get to see them in. President Obama did not use Camp a lot, went there 39 times, but he did something very unique. He let his staff use Camp David. So it wasn't quite serving the president, but you were serving people that the president allowed to go there, which I got to experience once when President Clinton let the entire President Carter family come to Camp David. So I got to meet another president and what his memory of Camp David and what it did for him. A few stories about my time. We are looking into Camp David. You may recognize by now, this is Aspen. Cedar is located over here. This is Change of Command Day. Again, it was a great honor to serve, but after 26 months, you're ready to move on and get back to what you normally do for a job. Our day office, Cedar, seasonal shots. And then this phrase, perfect but natural. This is probably my best leadership lesson I took away from Camp David. You get to handpick all your sailors and Marines. You pick every single person that comes there. You interview them, you do a background check, you decide who gets to come. You've got a lot of A players. And then you all go and do the mission. And then how do you deal with everyday things? I think people do make mistakes. We all make mistakes. How do you deal with trying to give everyone some important job to do? When during the interview they all understood they were going to have to cut grass, replant flower beds, make beds, walk the perimeter. How do you maintain morale when there's lots of visits or there's no visits? How do you as a commanding officer maintain your own presence? How do you keep your own humility? How do you learn how to talk to a president? Not being too uptight, nervous, but not being too relaxed like you're my buddy. How do you essentially be perfect but natural? Like this photo of Holly in my favorite cabin after a perfect snowfall. But how do you light a fire? How do you clean his path? Where do you put all the snow? How do you keep Camp David looking like Camp David? Why did Nancy Reagan complain once when all the leaves on the backyard of Aspen were gone in the fall setting? Because we tried too hard to please. We scrubbed nature. You don't scrub nature. You can clean nature up, but we scrubbed it. She noticed there were no leaves. True story, that night Seabees went out. True story. Perfect, but natural. Probably the most fascinating thing I observed firsthand was the Middle East Peace Summit of the summer of 2000. This was the 6th formal meeting, President Clinton meeting with Yasser Arafat, PLO chairman, Ehud Barak, Prime Minister of Israel. This was going to be it for his administration. Summer, his last year in office, peace treaty, just like Carter did in '78, something similar. 5-day notice they were coming, worked with the Department of State, and we get ready to host 3 delegations, U.S., Palestinian, Israeli. As I demonstrated at the beginning, here's the opening day where I welcomed President Clinton. In my dress uniform today, I had some help from Secretary Albright. Typically, you also get to greet world leaders. Prime Minister Barak had flown in from Tel Aviv via Andrews Air Force Base. Yasser Arafat wanted nothing to do with American transport. No aircraft, no sedans, nothing. Didn't want to be greeted, was left alone. Only by happenstance do I run into him inside the Laurel cabin. Now I'm in my Camp David casual, we call it, polo shirt, khakis. And the White House photographer is standing where you're seated and happens to snap this photo. Probably the most surreal photo I have of me with anyone else. And you realize he's a person just like you and me. Different background, different beliefs, but we're still humans. And for about 2 weeks, I watched President Clinton desperately try to achieve some world peace, some type of treaty, which he considered one of his greatest failures. At least that's what he dictates in his book, My Life, where he talks about the inability to forge a Middle East peace treaty. Administration ends. It's his final visit weekend. Perfect but natural. How do you say goodbye to a president? Is it our job to say goodbye to a president? Went back in the archives. I found things from the Reagan and Bush senior administrations, probably things that Commander Camp did. There was some protocol on saying goodbye. Got permission from the White House military office to do a little thing at the chapel that last Sunday and something that night. So that morning of the last chapel service, and there was President Clinton with his music. My wife, Michelle, and the chaplain's wife, Ginger Williams, are giving them some gifts. This is a photo that hung in the vestibule for 8 years. Mrs. Clinton is now Senator-elect Clinton. This was the 2000 election, so she's now Senator-elect of New York. Chelsea's a student at Stanford. That was Sunday morning after a raucous 4-day visit where he invited a lot of friends and congressional members up to say goodbye. And the final Sunday night in January of 2001, we have a ceremony inside the hangar. Senator-elect Clinton makes some remarks. The president makes some remarks. Buddy sits there and chews his ball. The Master Chief and I make some remarks. And then the Clinton family graciously takes one last photo with the Camp David crew. Okay. There's some Army uniforms in the background. That's because we have the White House Communications Agency debt there. You'll see some Army here, but most of this is Navy and Marine Corps. And then the final moments. You walk out to that dark night, January, it's cold, snow on the ground, the helicopter blades are starting to turn, and you're saying goodbye to the president and senator-elect. What do you say? Hey, good job, have a good life. The president said, Mike, call me if you need anything. I lost his card, I can't find it. And then Chelsea turns to me. Chelsea Clinton turns to me and she says, Commander, I've had these 2 stuffed animals in my bedroom for 8 years in Aspen. I'd like you to give them to your daughters. And she hands them to me. Again, those little poignant, simple moments of goodwill and a gesture. They board the helicopter, the hatch shuts, they lift off, we salute, and that's for me the last time I saw the Clinton family. So again, highs and lows, lots of excitement, and then it all ends. There's a funny story in the book about election night in the Jell-O. Read it. It's about the Jell-O. After 36 days, we learned that President Bush will be the next occupant of Aspen. President Bush certainly knew Camp David from his dad, loved Camp David. Remember the first time he showed up, he jumped in the golf cart won. He said, Mike, show me around. So I just did a perimeter and dropped them off at Aspen. I mean, what am I going to tell them, right? Maybe he saw a new building. What impressed me initially was, again, about building relationships with President Bush. Just a few weeks into his administration, in February, he invites Prime Minister and Mrs. Blair of Great Britain. Bushes and Blairs had never met. Blairs were great friends of the Clintons. They had visited Camp David with the Clintons. But I found it interesting, at this time in the world, February of 2001, the Bushes reach out to the Blairs, invite them to Camp David. And that weekend was just lighthearted. It was fun. It was just 2 couples getting to know each other. Probably our #1 ally in the world. I think this had a lot to do with what happened 7 months later and how Tony Blair was in the congressional chambers when President Bush announced what we were going to do, how Tony Blair and why he said, America, we will always be by your side. I'm sure Great Britain would have always been by our side. But I got to believe building relationships during peacetime has a lot to do with what you do when you need a friend. President Bush did a similar thing with Prime Minister Koizumi of Japan. My last official visit in July of 2001 before I departed, he welcomed Prime Minister Koizumi. I learned recently from hearing President Bush speak in San Diego that on September 12th, Koizumi had called President Bush and said, Mr. President, thank you for your time together in July. We will always stand with you shoulder to shoulder. Build relationships before you need them. That's what I took away from Camp David, principally. As I said, the Bushes love Camp David. I got to meet the elder Bushes several times. Wonderful to see this family come here, have fun, recreate. share with our family a meal, attend our chapel service, listen to our chaplain, enjoy our chaplain and his message. Evergreen Chapel, the only facility at Camp David built by private money and donated, gifted to the United States. Camp David didn't have a chapel prior to 1991. If the president wanted to worship, he either did his own thing or he just showed up in Thurmont, Maryland at church. This was built by a private contractor, retired, got approval by President Reagan, groundbreaking President George H.W. Bush, and during our time we celebrated the 10-year anniversary of Evergreen Chapel, a non-denominational place of worship. After the service, both presidents stood at the chapel doors and took family photos with everyone who attended. Again, just a gracious sharing of time, a very human act. And then it's our time to go. Final time, President Bush invites the family down to the White House. He spends about 30 minutes showing the girls and the family around the rose garden, pointing out things about the trees, writing the girls a few notes. To Mike, Michelle, Ryan, and Brianna, we will miss you at Camp David. Best wishes, George Bush. And off we go. So if you ever get to visit Camp David, Elaine, I don't know if you have this photo. We would take your photo in front of the iconic sign. You got that photo? Okay. And with that, with the simple note of 19 years ago and what my wife and daughters gave me and the inspiration for this book, I thank you for your attention tonight, and I'm open to any questions or comments you may have. Thank you.
You mentioned that Nancy Reagan wanted leaves. She got leaves. President George W. Bush wanted a bike trail. He got a bike trail. First President Bush wanted a horseshoe pit. He got a horseshoe pit. And President Eisenhower wanted a different name. He got a different name. Was there any time during your time or any other time that you are aware of where a president wanted something that was just unbelievably unreasonable?
Not from my experience. I remember George H.W. Bush telling one of our commanding officers, it might have been Joe Camp, when I ask for a rowboat, don't give me an aircraft carrier, or something to that effect. Because he knew he could sense the crew always wanted to please. And again, it's that perfect but natural. But I never had personally any request by the president. In fact, I'll give you something opposite. I remember being in Cedar, my house, and back then we didn't have cell phones, they weren't invented yet. We had pagers, and my pager went off. It said, please call Aspen. That's either really good or really bad. Please call Aspen. I call Aspen. Mrs. Bush gets on the line, Laura Bush. Hello, Mike. Do you think it'd be okay if the president's brother Marvin came up tomorrow? Well, Mrs. Bush, you know, we only have so many hamburger patties, and, you know, food line's closing soon. And of course, Mrs. Bush, please invite him up. I saw more of the graciousness of no presumption of being owed anything. And the president and their guests were almost always gracious. And I never had a personal experience where he couldn't deliver what they wanted. Thank you.
One other question, if I can. 2 years deliberately, for a CO, deliberately overlapping two presidents most likely, or sometimes. Is that the right amount of time to be a CO?
Our COs will range from 2 to 3 years. Joe, what did you do? 2.5. He did 2.5. Some have done 3. Sometimes the White House Military Office, that's the organization in the East Wing who oversees Marine One, the White House Communications Agency, the White House mess, the doctors, the nurses, the mill aides, the boss for us. Sometimes they want the CO to bridge administrations. I don't think it really matters, but sometimes it's a nice comfort thing. Our officers do 2 to 3 years. Our enlisted do 3 to 5 years typically.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. And he read the book, as you can tell.
Yeah.
Hi. Just by comparison, are you aware of what the French president, the British prime minister, other democracies, what their leaders, do they have anything comparable?
Maybe. Britain has a palace, a home called Chequers. And there's been talk about trying to use it similar way. President Macron of France has been considering an old fort on a land spit, refurbishing it to be used kind of like Camp David. So outside of personal residences, those are the only two I'm aware of that have something similar to what Camp David is.
And just one other question. You mentioned Richard Nixon was somewhat reclusive there, and then you touched on the idea of a symbol, a place of building relationships, and that doesn't seem to be going on currently. But during Nixon's time, was that similar, or did he initiate any kind of?
Well, he kind of had the dipoles. He would eat by himself and be by himself, but then he was great at détente, right? He was great at going to China. He was great at bringing Leonid Brezhnev to Camp David and gifting him that blue Lincoln Continental. So he used it for the diplomatic purpose, but as a personal respite, he was very reclusive. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you for all attending.
My husband's cringing now, like, what am I going to say? You shared with us some really fabulous photos of Camp David, and I was just wondering, how did you get access? Are they all public, unclassified photos?
Thank you, Susie, for asking. Everything you saw, folks, is a public document, either from the internet or from the White House photo office. Okay? To get this, because I'm retired military, my book had to be vetted by the Department of Defense. Now, they're vetting it not for what I say, they're vetting it for security things. So they saw the photos, they read all the words, and there were two minor redactions in the manuscript. So it was approved, and it had to be. If you don't do that as a military member, you are subject to lawsuits, and you're subject to that scrutiny. So yes, you have to be mindful of protecting the privacy and what you say, but also using images that are not private. These are all from archives. Yes, sir.
So commanding Camp David must be a unique assignment in the Navy. Is there a typical career trajectory that leads one to that assignment?
I think you've done well up to the rank of commander. You've done in the Civil Engineer Corps most of the duties that you're expected to. People ask me often, why did you get picked? And I say, I don't know. We nominate about 3 to 4 officers to the White House, and they decide, the White House Military Office. I think what happens, and having done this when picking crew members, is you're looking for fit. So when you interview people personally, it's not just really your technical background anymore, or the resume, it's the fit, the personality, the charisma, the integrity, the humility. That's how I think it works well.
And what was your immediate prior assignment?
I was the public works officer at Naval Base Coronado in San Diego, California. So kind of a city engineer. I was a city engineer of Ann Arbor, and I got shipped to the White House, or to the Camp David.
Okay, thank you.
What's the annual budget for Camp David, if that's public available?
Well, these are public matters, so during my time it was about $3.4 million. Okay? That's appropriated money because this is a naval facility. It does have a mission in the continuity of the president, supporting the presidency. Now, when a president, I'll tell you this, when the president invites his own guests to Camp David, all that food and beverage is paid for by the president. So we have to keep separate records, right? You probably know this from your archive business, right, Elaine? So, yes, they get donations. Yes, they have a lot of input, but those records are kept separately. There's a mission of Camp David for national security and the retreat. Anything beyond that is up to the president. The presidents will redecorate the cabins. That's their expense. And almost every first lady, principally the first lady is getting very involved with this, redecorates the cabins. They have all honored the traditions of Camp David. President and Mrs. Trump are redecorating the cabins now. They are not making them 5-star hotels, trust me. They are honoring the history. They are honoring the locale of the mountain retreat. They are respecting the decorum of the retreat. Okay? I think that's wonderful that every president family has done that.
The hollowed out log chair really intrigues me. Can you talk about the care and maintenance you do on certain things like that? And is there any other mementos that are similar to that are passed on and every president uses, and you guys look at it as a sacred thing for our country.
That tree log I learned comes from an Amish tree farm in Indiana. And there have been several over the years because they do rot. You'll see some photos where they're smaller, some photos where they're larger. It's a cutout bench. There's a tree with a little feed box for the fish. We used to have trout when I was there, now they're koi. So guests can feed the fish. It's just those little things like that, very simple, that adorn some of the camp. But again, not a lot of amenities, just the basics. We do have a lounge, we do have a bar and gift shop. We retain the name Shangri-La for that. So you still have a bit of a history and a gift shop you can buy mementos from. Holly cabin I talked about. Presidential papers are kept there as well as donated books. So not an official archive, but a secondary archive, if you will, of presidential papers. And inside Aspen, we would keep some of the records over the years of press clippings, newspapers, magazines of the presidents before mass media and the internet were invented. Okay, thank you. Elaine.
Talk about, you can repeat the question, facilities for the troops that people stationed there, the bowling alley.
Sure. So facilities for the troops are the same facilities for the president. Now the president has the pool, the hourglass-shaped pool. Despite Nixon's reclusiveness, he put a lot of money into the camp, U.S. budget, and built extended Laurel, the main cabin. He put this pool in and some of the other amenities. But we don't use that pool, but there's a staff pool. There's a skeet range. There's a driving range. President Eisenhower put in the putting green behind Aspen. Robert Trent Jones designed it. There's 3 tee boxes, putting green. There's a bowling alley, a movie theater, okay, horseshoe pit, as you all know now, playground. Yes, sir.
So when you had to prepare for the meeting with the head of the Jewish state and the Palestinian state, I'm not sure how tactfully, but how do you handle questioning the aides of each of those leaders for security purposes?
So one of the first things I did for that visit was I called the CO who was there in 1978. He was in Florida, retired. I said, hey, how'd you get ready for this? We didn't have much time either. And they did things differently then. They actually took a kitchen and made it kosher. Fast forward to 2000, I had the luxury of working with the Department of State. And so with the Department of State, we strategize, okay, who gets how many cabins? Because remember, the Palestinians thought this was a trap. And they were always very dubious about going to Camp David. And my job was to make everything look equitable. So if we gave the U.S.-Israeli delegation 5 golf carts, then the Palestinians get 5 golf carts. The Palestinians get 3 cabins, and the Israelis get 3 cabins. All those simple little things. What about meals? What about alcohol? Those guest cabins have a nice fleet of alcohol. Some cultures don't drink alcohol, so what do you do out of courtesy? You remove all the alcohol. Every cabin had to be the same. If someone wanted to drink, they went to the bar. Meals. We had kosher meals brought up from Washington, D.C. 3 times a day. Plus we had our bar food at the galley, at the bar, and then our galley was open almost around the clock. Worship. We thought we had an ecumenical chapel. We had a Torah. We even had prayer rugs. We learned later, Prime Minister Barack went in and another guest went into the chapel and read the Torah to our Navy chaplain. Fascinating to see that in real life. We learned that later the Palestinians still considered it a place of Christian and Jewish worship and avoided it. So you prepare as much as you can, you work with the staff you have, and it's all about just appearing to be open to everyone. One tough moment. One of the Palestinian cabins, Rosebud, was right across the street from Cedar, our house. The Palestinians were in there smoking from their hookah. This is July. Air conditioning works fine, but the windows are open. They're smoking from the hookah. The fireplace is going, and what happens? Our fire alarm system goes off. Well, Camp David, when you have a fire, and we're all taught, our crew is all taught to fight structural fires and aircraft fires, we respond. And when you respond with some Marines as well, because you don't know what's going on. So you're Palestinians in this cabin, in this place you don't know, and you've never driven a golf cart, and you're in this strange place with air conditioning you don't understand, and all of a sudden these military forces surround your cabin. My CDO was a young naval officer. She was on duty. She approached the cabin. I was fortunately nearby. I approached. And it was very interesting, and I have this in the book, about what the Palestinian delegation was doing. They were shoving papers into the fire. They were shoving papers into the toilet. I must have felt they were under attack or we were coming to seize things. So you think about it, yeah, but this really could have gone south in a real hurry. So it took a bit of quick recovery and explanation and decorum to say this was only a response to the fire alarms and an apology and to know how to back away quickly. Okay, so those are those little things that really test you about how to handle all those sensitivities with other cultures. Thank you.
Talk about Carter and the placement of the cabins in his negotiations.
So President Carter, as I said, wanted to close. Elaine's question was, how did Carter, when he was convinced by Rosalynn to bring them to Camp David, what else did he do to make sure they got into each other's space? So he picked Hawley. There's a small conference room in Hawley. It's very tight. It's maybe just like right this much space. And there was a round table in it. He intentionally chose that space. Why? As opposed to Laurel with a bigger conference room or more space. Right. Why did he pick that? To get intimate, to get face-to-face, eyeball to eyeball, body language, all those things, to force the dialogue, to force the tense discussions. If you remember, Anwar Sadat once summoned his plane. He wanted to leave. He almost left halfway. He was convinced to stay. So very tense moments. I'm sure that happened with President Clinton and his two guests as well. But President Carter, I think, was very smart to force the dialogue to get in each other's personal space, and then also have the environment to take a walk together when you need to calm down a bit. Yes, sir.
Because there is no on-base lodging other than for the commander at Camp David. Is that a challenge, or is that something that the sailors appreciate that they're able to live off base?
Yes, so our family lives inside camp. We have barracks for single sailors and Marines, but all other families live outside in the local community. We did have a Navy housing area in Thurmont. Everyone else could live on the economy. That's how it was when I was there. I think most families think it's a pain to come to camp. And it's being used without the president going very often. There's no appeal for people to go and even use the facilities, which they can use. They can go to the movie theater. They can go to the bowling alley. They can go to the library. But very few go to Camp David anymore. It was much more vibrant during my time, your time, much more vibrant. It was a real sense of community, even when the president wasn't there. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that that your children had no close playmates. Were you able to have family and friends visit your house?
I mean, it's a wonderful place to entertain on the weekend when the president's not there. Great, no one turns down an invitation to Camp David. So that was fun. That's what made it bearable. Even friends from San Diego would come and visit on a non-visit weekend. We could have play dates. Just sometimes play dates were hard because they still have to come through security. They still have to get checked. Their car has to be searched if they're coming inside, or we pick them up. So it just made it a little more complicated. I had young girls. Getting to school and catching the school bus on a golf cart in February could be very difficult. One family homeschooled their 4 children. Some families have had infants there. Some families have had kids in college or high school. What ages were your children, your 2 sons?
6 and 9.
So similar to 4 and 7, elementary, middle school. So everyone's got a different experience from raising a family.
But you had to be ready 24/7 if they decided they...
Always ready. And here's my best story. This was what gave me the best lesson about trusting your people. The day of the change of command, June 25th, 1999, there's no visit on the books. Change of command happens, 10 o'clock, Friday morning, very typical for Navy. Salute, take charge, and during the ceremony, word comes from the White House that President Clinton's coming that night. Now, you're always kind of ready, but right now we have a big reception and a party afterwards. You have all these guests, my predecessor and me, my family, my relatives, and it's like, okay, everyone leave. So what did it do for me? Well, let's face it, folks, I don't know jack at this point, right? I don't know much. I sit down in the kickoff meeting to get ready for that night, and what's it force me to do? Listen to your people. Try to ask a smart question once in a while. But it really set my gauge for the next 2 years. Trust your people. Listen to your people. Delegate to your people. And that night when I walked down that ramp for the first time and greeted the president, and he knew who I was, Chelsea did, and she says, "Who are you?" Off we go. I couldn't have asked for a better start, to be honest with you. A bit of a pucker factor, but a great way to get into it. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
I think I heard you say that Arafat did not want to use our transportation.
Correct.
How did he get it?
So Yasser Arafat, the question is, he didn't want to use our transportation. He came up under his own motorcade. So if the president can't fly into Camp David because of the weather, even by helicopter, he will motorcade by sedan with a great police escort up 70 miles to Camp David. That's how other world leaders came in.
His own.
Yeah. And the question about security, no one carries weapons at Camp David except Secret Service and our Marines. So we have all kinds of checkpoints and entry protocol on what can be brought into Camp David.
And I have one more thought too, and this may be not something you can't answer, I don't know, but the perimeter for security is always, you've got all your staff, but are there barriers of any sort that just keep people from sneaking through the woods?
Yes, so don't try it. She asked about sneaking through the woods. She wants to sneak through the woods, okay? I don't care if you do the Marine Qual. Don't do it, okay? There are precautions, let's put it that way, okay? About security. Obviously, I'm not going to talk about security. It's very secure. Yes, sir.
So I take it that all civilian visits are by invitation only?
Correct. And you either know the CO. If you didn't know me or him, then you missed your chance. Or you know the president. There's really no other way to be invited up. I mean, our crew members can bring up family with permission, with a quick social security check, but not quite to the level of a visit with the CO or the first family. Yes, sir.
When Marine One comes to bring the president, does it stay there until he leaves?
It does. Push him into the hangar, unless he's just staying for a few hours. Again, always ready to move the president. That's the case around the world. When our president goes overseas, we take our sedans, we take our helicopters. I don't care what administration's in charge, it's expensive to go overseas. But no matter who you are, we take all our stuff with us. We take all our comm gear, our security, our food security, everything. That's how we guard our official, our executive. Not all countries do it that way. Yes, ma'am.
Approximately how many crew members?
About 200 during my time, about 200 sailors and Marines. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I greatly appreciate your interest and wonderful questions and knowledge. There are books for sale. I'm going to hang out for a while, sign your books if you'd like to buy one, have it personalized. Thank you for your time. Elaine, thank you to you and the Ford Library and the Foundation for hosting me. I wish you all a great week. Thank you again.
Now, what did I tell you? Wasn't this a reason to come tonight? This is fabulous, simply fabulous. And he's right about the security, because when we went in and we were bused from Washington up through the hills and all of this, and our bus was thoroughly checked, and of course we had all been individually pre-checked, and we all have, appropriate identification and all of that. So they take it very seriously. But it's an amazing place, and you have a wealth of stories which we thought you would have, and I'm so thrilled you came. And for your book signing and beyond, we have a pair of pens with Gerald Ford's signature.
Wonderful.
May you use them, and we're in good health for many, many years. Thank you
Elaine.
so
Thank you,
much.
folks. Thank you
This
very
is
much.
great, simply great.
Thank you, folks.